Brilliant. Thanks so much, Helen. And I'd like to welcome Rebecca to the Cynefin meetup. I'm really, really pleased. I initially met Rebecca when I was doing quite a lot of work going up to Canberra on a regular basis. And then Rebecca started to come along to the Canberra version of the Cynefin meetup, which I really appreciate. And I'm so happy because Rebecca's going to tell her story. As you're hearing Rebecca tell the story, it's not all about Cynefin. It's quite orthogonal to the Cynefin framework. There is a nice Cynefin component in it. But have a think about how you might use some of the concepts that Rebecca is talking about. Okay, and then if you can hold any questions that you have until we get to the end, that would be really good. But Rebecca, I'm going to be presenting for you, so I'll progress the slides as we go along. Just let me know when to, and I shall start presenting, and I'll let you get into introducing yourself.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim and Helen, for that great introduction. And thank you everyone else for joining us. So my name is Rebecca Gordon and I am Canberra based, but I will jump straight into my story. So it started on Anzac Day last year when I discovered almost by chance that I had a brain tumour. And I mean no disrespect for the day itself, but lest we forget, had taken on a whole new meaning for me. So as you can imagine, and as Kim explained, this is a personal story, but it's one that I wanted to share about how I came to more fully understand and appreciate how my agile thinking and specifically Cynefin was helping me deal with this turn of events. So I will go into the story in a bit of depth before I jump into Cynefin, because I think as practitioners, we have a tendency to jump into planning or problem solving before we really appreciate what the problem is that we're trying to solve. But I promise you I will get there, and so I appreciate your patience, and I'll explain how I was trying to make sense of what was happening to me. So next slide, please, Kim. And the next one. That was the Anzac Day one. Jump ahead. Great. So the discovery led to a huge upheaval for my plans for that year, including I was supposed to start a new position leading up a significant government transformational program. But I'm guessing that I was not alone because in the last few years, I think many of our plans have come undone. And the news commentators talk about how unprecedented it's been. But I have to say that I'm really uncomfortable whenever I hear that term, because I think our life itself always has been, to varying degrees, unprecedented for us. And to a certain extent unpredictable. But that doesn't mean that we can't try and make sense of the life, of our life, and to work through our problems using the tools and the resources that we have available to us. So to set the scene, I was in holidays in central Victoria in between COVID lockdowns. And for those of you not in Australia, that's we had state by state lockdown, and there were a number of months where I couldn't get down there. And I was down there seeing my family, and I was able to catch up with a lot of relatives and friends, and see babies who had been born before lockdown, who are now up and walking. And it all felt very normal, just sitting down and watching the footy. And it had been a perfect break between finishing up with my previous job and presumably starting the new one the following day. I literally had a clean slate, screen, and an empty Kanban, if you will. And I was ready for all things new that the universe was about to throw at me. At least I thought I was, because those expectations came crashing down on me when minutes before I was about to jump into the car and drive the 8 hours back to Melbourne, I slipped and fell on the stairs at my brother's place, and I landed on my back and I hit my head. And I passed out with what I later discovered was a seizure. So whilst I didn't have a very clear, and I still don't have a very clear understanding of or recollection of exactly what happened next, I understand that there are a number of frantic phone calls taking place, calling an ambulance and letting my husband and kids know that I probably wouldn't be heading home as planned. So instead of jumping into my car, the next thing you know, I was in an ambulance on my way to hospital. And the hospital performed a CT scan, and they discovered what they described as a large mass on my brain, or as I more affectionately came to know it as Bob the Blob. So after discovery, they wanted to put me into another ambulance and send me to a hospital that was 2 hours away and even further away from home to have a specialised MRI. And they also advised me that I should prepare myself for brain surgery later, later that week. Now, just as I was coming to grips with that news, more discussions and phone calls took place when the ER doctor reevaluated the situation and agreed that I could go back home again and book into the Canberra hospital instead. So this was the first indication of things going backwards and forwards over the next few weeks that I needed to get used to. And I was dealing with emerging requirements, things that just kept cropping up that I needed to make decisions on. And I had very little information to go by. And what I was reading and hearing was actually contradictory. So in a very real sense, I was living in a VUCA world. Next slide, please, Skip. And VUCA is the acronym first coined by the US military, covering volatility and uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And when I first came across this term, it was in the context of managing complex projects and programs. And I don't know that I ever thought that I would be using it for myself. But when you're in a VUCA situation, it can be very overwhelming and for many reasons difficult to get out of. So you need to try and make sense of what's happening and choose the right steps and plan your way through the mess. And in my case, I literally wanted to take control and flip it on its head. So next slide. I looked for information that would help me move out of that state and move instead towards vision and understanding and clarity and agility. Now, the initial doctor had not shown me the scan results in the hospital, and instead he gave me a disc to take back to my treating doctor here in Canberra. But thanks to my brother and his insight into running computer programs, we were able to read the disc, and I was able to see for myself what the doctors had found. Now, whilst I had absolutely no medical understanding of what the images meant, it did give me a sense of clarity, and I could see what I was dealing with. And it gave me that first piece of information that I needed to help me move forward. So I'd like to introduce you to my squatter, Bob.
Whoa.
Who should pause for reaction there, who, unbeknown to me, had been slowly growing in the back of my head for about the last 20 years. Now, it did take another couple of weeks to see my local GP, find a neurosurgeon, and big call out for Dr. Justin Pick here in Canberra. book into the appointments until I finally had the specialised MRI that I needed. And although I thought it was pretty obvious on the first scan what was going on, the second one gave the neurosurgeon a much clearer look at what was happening, and which confirmed this peach-sized meningioma tumour sitting on my brain. And I don't know how clearly you can see that, but it actually looks like he's laughing at me. Right. So over the preceding couple of weeks, what little I had been able to discover was that the most likely scenario would be I would be put on what they call a wait and watch list. Basically, that I would need to have regular MRIs probably for the rest of my life. And if it grew or it started to impact me, then maybe in time they may have to proceed with surgery. Next slide. But what I didn't understand or realise was that I was already showing some concerning symptoms, and the tumour was invading the space where my brain should have been and causing problems. So after years of having severe headaches and failing eyesight, and generally being uncoordinated, and apparently my inability to do the dance for Nutbush City Limits. And my apologies for anyone overseas, but please Google that. Australian Nutbush City Limits, it's a hoot, but I can't do it, literally do it. I had dismissed those signs as just getting awkward and always being just like a little bit awkward and clumsy. But they were actually likely being caused by the increasing pressure of the growing tumour on my brain. So I should add that most of this took place in May, which coincidentally or ironically is Brain Tumour Action Awareness Month. Next slide, thanks, Kim. And I can tell you the irony of that was not lost on me, because I was becoming very aware of brain tumours. So until this happened to me, personally, I'd only known of 2 people who had had a brain tumour, and I knew very little, if anything, about how it actually impacted on them. Next slide. So, like all good business analysts, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. And I was actually advised by the doctor's office not to Google brain tumours. But of course I did. And I went searching for information. And I did find some pretty interesting stuff. Such as there's over 130 different categories and subcategories of brain tumours, depending on their size, location, severity, and even their DNA composition. Kim, I'll just get you to scroll through there. And they slowly grow in the membrane covering the brain and the spinal cord. Sadly, in what is supposed to be the protective layer between the skull and the brain. And whilst 70% of them are not cancerous, benign tumours can still be life-threatening. So although I was advised that mine was likely to be benign, I was also told that it didn't mean that it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. I also discovered that on average, 17 Australians a day are diagnosed with a brain tumour. So although I knew that I was not alone in this, as many other people were going or had gone through similar disruptions to their lives. So doctors and researchers are continuously searching for information to understand how they occur and why they grow, and how best to remove or treat them. There are a number of clinical studies happening across the world, testing all those different theories. And probably on a monthly basis, I read another article about some other theory and some new study going on. And, you know, like my fascination with understanding tumours was definitely growing. And I wanted those answers and clarity. So for those who know me, you'll know that my various roles through work in the last 2 decades or so have literally been to try and understand how the brain works in relation to how we learn, how we engage with each other as project groups, and how to achieve the best outcomes from the time that we spend working and training. So my ability to learn and using my brain, I had always considered it to be my strongest asset. And when I imagined myself shuffling off this mortal coil, I expected it that my physical body would be the one to let me down. So when I found out that my brain was in trouble, it absolutely rocked me. And in the weeks that followed the diagnosis, it forced me to rethink many things. So on reflection, we all have those moments in our lives which change or define us, whether it's a choice or a decision that we make, or like me, it's just circumstances that are just thrust on you. Our ability to react positively to what's happening, or at the very least, our level of acceptance to that change, is what can help us work through and survive any potential negative impacts on our lives. Let's get you to go ahead a couple of screens there. So our brains are hardwired to keep us in our comfort zone, nice and safe. But whether or not that is the best position for us to be in, our negative thoughts can sabotage us to not move ahead. So we have to visualize success and train our brains to move through that fear zone and into a learning and growth area instead. And I needed that growth mindset and the tools to accept my brain wasn't working in the way that I thought it was supposed to, but also to find out how I could turn this potential disaster into a challenge. All right, so next slide. I understand people who can perform at their peak despite being in a stressful situation, like elite athletes and performance car race drivers. They often describe themselves as being in the zone. They are focused on the end goal and they don't allow fear of the unknown to hold them back. And it's with that mindset that they tend to achieve a far better outcome, and in which they can accept the challenge as an opportunity. So I embrace this model because this diagnosis to me was the most complex challenge that I had had so far in my life. And I needed those tools out of the toolkit, which I've been gradually building up over the years. But before I started, I wanted to have a clear vision to anchor me. And this was simply to make every day count. So I made sure that every day that I could, I set out with a positive goal and I pushed myself through that fear zone. But I'm not suggesting, and I'm not going to fool myself, that it was all sunshines and rainbows, because I'm comfortable to admit in hindsight that I had some pretty bad days where I needed help to get through them. So I sought the advice of others to help me to understand this. I think people tend to learn better when they willingly share experiences and lessons through stories and reflection, that we absorb what we learn from others and we re-engineer it into our own minds to apply where it works best for us. Unfortunately, I hadn't quite arrived at that Zen moment yet, as far as the tumour went, because just prior to getting the second scan, I had to go back to work and start my new role with my new team. And in hindsight, I was just sort of choosing to ignore the reality of the first diagnosis. And in my state of doubt and fear, I lost my confidence because instead of joining this new team as an asset that I thought I was, I saw myself as a potential liability instead. And as this negative thought took hold, it actually probably was the scariest moment in the whole story for me, because I had no idea about what was going to happen. I had no project plan or picture in my mind of where I would be in the weeks and months, let alone the years ahead. But even though I didn't know how I was going to get around that, in the back of my mind, I knew that I had the training and the skills that I needed in order to cope. And I've certainly presented to staff on how to get out of problems. But before I could even come up with this mythical plan, within days of returning to work, I was back at square one on my little snakes and ladders again, because my neurosurgeon reviewed the MRI and he rang me and he brought forward his appointment to see me by almost 2.5 months. And then he booked me into surgery pretty much straight away. So as I was packing up my desk to go home, with no idea of if or when I would actually return, I had only sat at this desk for a few days and I had hardly unpacked, but I had pinned my Cynefin handout to the wall. So since being wowed by David Snowden, whose framework this is, at a presentation in Canberra in 2019, which Kim had invited me to, this pamphlet pretty much came everywhere with me. And to this day, I regret not getting it signed by the man himself. When I had the chance. So my little side lesson here is always take advantage of an opportunity when it presents itself. I'm sure Dave would have signed it if I'd asked.
I'm sure we can make that happen for you, Rebecca.
So Cynefin, for those not familiar with it, is a Welsh word, and I'm quoting now directly from David's website. It signifies the multiple entwined factors in our environment and our experiences that influences how we think and interpret and act in ways that maybe we can never really fully understand. But put more simply for me, Cynefin describes a sense-making framework which can help us navigate through a crisis like a compass and points us into the direction that we could go in. So in essence, there are 5 domains or levels of complexity of a problem, and which help us understand where our challenges best fit, and then how to make the right decisions and take the appropriate actions within that context. It's a recognition that the problems do not have a single solution or pathway to get out of it. The framework itself then provides a 4-stage approach for assessing the type of crisis that you're in and initiating the right response, adopting to a new pace, and starting to understand what is happening around you. Then you take what you do know and begin to innovate for the answers that you need but may not have expected. And finally, and hopefully, you transcend the crisis, lock in those lessons learned, and along the way, build up your resilience to future problem solving. So next slide. So this is a newer diagram which is now up on the website, and there's been a slight change in some of the terminology. But as I was holding on to the original pamphlet that I had, I was struck by the thought of how relevant that it was to me. When I was first told that I had the brain tumour, I most definitely fell head first into the disorder and confused and remained right in the middle. My family, my work, and how I lived my life was suddenly thrown into the unknown, and I was trying to comprehend a condition that I knew nothing about. But over the first few weeks, I felt like slowly, very slowly, I was moving out of that disorder into the chaotic domain. I still didn't know what I was dealing with, as I hadn't had the second MRI at that stage. And I thought my appointment with the neurosurgeon was still months away. But I did know that I needed to start taking some action, even if it was just small steps, that I could move myself out of that chaos into a place of relative stability, and into some sense of order, albeit still in a complex state. Next slide. So I started asking a lot of questions. I used customer experience research techniques that we were learning at work on myself. I joined support groups, I read case studies, and I reached out to other people who had already had the surgery, and I listened to them about how they felt and about what happened to them. I took it as an opportunity not to tell them my story as much, but to hear from them what their story had been. But I also began journaling what was happening to me, what I was being told, and what decisions that I needed to make, so that I could assess what I needed to do and to put that magical project plan into place. So the other clear realization that I had was that whilst I was moving between the chaotic and the complex domains, my neurosurgeon was not. He was, I think, quite safely in the complicated, quite possibly even in the obvious domain, as he had 20 years plus experience in this, and he understood and he knew what he was dealing with. And he responded to me with options. He made me aware of those clinical studies to consider and the treatments other than surgery. But he put all of those signals that I mentioned earlier, and he explained to me the risk of not taking action. Now, I don't know if my neurosurgeon had training in the Cynefin framework, but he certainly did all the right things for him to help me lead me through this problem. He wasn't complacent. There were still known unknowns. So he asked questions, he discussed my case with his colleagues, he investigated my medical history, and he talked me through it. But whilst reassuring me at every stage, he also didn't sugarcoat the possibilities, the possible outcomes, because even though he knew what he was doing, and my tumour was one that could be relatively easily removed for a neurosurgeon, the reality was that this was still brain surgery, and there were definitely risks involved. So he was transparent, and he created a safe space for me to ask questions. And I think most importantly, his use of really simple language in explaining to me the complexity of what a tumour looked like. So next slide. Which he described like a rock sitting on the ground, which he would come in and scoop up and take away. Sounds so easy. Next slide. Not like the more troublesome tumours, which he described more like trees, with their roots burrowing down into the brain. But my rock did have a little tail which couldn't be removed, which he needed to still cut the blood supply off too. And there was a very real risk of residual nerve damage and potentially longer-term rehabilitation, not because of the tumour itself, but as a result of the surgery. So in a sense, he took on that servant leadership role, guiding me through to where I needed to be in order to make my own decisions. And that was important to me. And next slide, please, Kim, because there were there were people that I met, and when I was talking to them about their experiences, I did come across people who were so overwhelmed by the options and the complexity of what they were facing that they didn't want to think about it, and they couldn't or wouldn't make a decision. So we have the classic on the next slide, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. And when I was talking this through with Kim a while ago, and we likened this to when you see organisational inertia, when it's seemingly too hard to change and the problems are too big, and no one attempts to make any real improvements because they're missing a framework of reference to move forward. But eventually, if you don't do anything, or if you take the wrong type of action, it can come crashing down on you. So you have to do something, take that first step, and to play with my little analogy, begin my dance. So on Queen's birthday, long weekend last year, I underwent about 7.5 hours of brain surgery, a craniotomy, where they drilled several holes in the back of my skull, opened it up and cut out the tumour. And I can assure you that I did not look as cute as this little queen here. And next slide. Because, in fact, my crown for the day was a little less glamorous. But quickly move through that one, Kim. Underneath that lovely wrap, they had put my head back together again with about 30 staples. And fortunately, the surgery went well, and 99% of Bob the squatter was evicted.
Hooray!
So then I moved on to recovery, and it was here that the sprint planning that I learned with Agile became critical to my recovery. My training and thinking in increments and limiting my work in progress helped me break down what was potentially a life-changing moment to much smaller and palatable steps. Rather than being overwhelmed by the change and the what-if possibilities, I tackled what I could. But I systematically thought through what I needed to do and what I needed to know. And I had listened to what the other people had told me, with what they thought in hindsight, what they had put in place sooner. So I gave myself the license to push back on demand, which I know, like most of which I was making on myself. Everyone else just wanted me to stop and lay down, but I did need to deal with things in a slower time frame. But even before the surgery, I understood that this was not just about me getting through this. My family and my friends, my work colleagues were also potentially impacted. So I planned out who I would tell, how and when, and I staggered that as I needed to manage my energy levels to respond to their inevitable questions and concerns. And the little project manager in me, this was just like a stakeholder matrix, because not everyone needed to know everything, and other people needed to know a whole lot more. So based on the advice given to me by others, I knew that I couldn't and I shouldn't expect to get back to being the normal me for a number of months. So I set my expectations on what I knew that I could do by testing my limits gradually and improving my performance as I went, thinking of myself as a minimal viable product, and having incremental releases of my new features. But again, sometimes I really did push myself too hard. And I just got very tired. So I just need to spend a few days sleeping and reflecting. And I actually used the same retrospective techniques that I was employing at work, which is on the next screen. And just to think about what I had achieved, and what I could have done better, but also what I should not have done at all, and also to consider what could I commit myself next to. I needed to be aware of the new limits and the signals that my body was sending me, and look out and readjust my expectations as I went. And by taking those incremental steps and monitoring progress, it also meant that I could, with each achievement, I could congratulate myself on getting those smaller things done. And I also tried never to lose sight of my original vision of making every day count. So some of the other things which were critical to my recovery, but which I won't go too deeply in, but I do feel remiss not mentioning them as part of the story, because it is never about just having one set of tools and practices. We all need to ensure that we have a balance. So it was important for me to also have a good exercise routine, both physical and mental. To eat well, obviously, and balancing out my social life with my rest time. And perhaps I was actually fortunate that the COVID lockdowns were coinciding with all of this, because it actually forced me to stop and spend time recovering. So, wrapping up, agile and Cynefin thinking helped me to being open to learning, asking questions, and understanding my own vision and outcomes. It gave me a sense of knowing that there are always options when dealing with adversity, no matter how complex the problem seems, but also to work systematically and incrementally through a problem, and being able to respond to change by moving with it and not fighting against it. So, to close the loop on why I describe this session as dancing with a brain tumour, because problems like this, they're not a pre-planned project. There is no cookie cutter solution. There's no defined time frame. And I was literally taking one step forward and two steps back, and occasionally landing on my butt, and even once going through a wall, but that's okay. So I picture this dance certainly not as a graceful ballet, but hopefully not a mosh pit. To me, it was more like a tango. It was still erratic and exhausting, but it was exhilarating and most definitely even joyful. Because there were some very uplifting and even some very funny moments in this journey, and I think that's what I will hold on to. They're the things that I will remember the most. The support and the love that I was giving, the opportunities that I got out of it, even just like being here today, that this experience has actually given me. But I am still going to leave this story on a bit of a cliffhanger, because my definition of done is not there yet. Next slide, please, Kim. Because there are still some residual issues that I'm dealing with, but it definitely has not stopped me from adding more things to my dance card that I want to take a shot at doing. So thank you. That is my story. Well, maybe part one of my story. And I appreciate you spending time sharing it with me.
Yay! What a brilliant story, Rebecca.
Thank you.